I hired a guy to mow the lawn while my daughter was away. About an hour later, he called and whispered, "Sir, is anyone else in the house right now?" I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "I hear crying from your basement. That's not a TV." My name is Rick Caldwell. I'm 70 years old, a retired structural engineer and general contractor. I've spent my life building things from the ground up, making sure foundations are solid and structures are sound. You learn a thing or two about how the world works when you build it with your own two hands. You learn to trust your instincts, and you learn that when something feels wrong, it usually is. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed. I was sitting on my back porch enjoying a quiet moment with a cup of black coffee, watching the afternoon sun stretch across the lawn. The caller ID showed it was Tyler, the 22-year-old kid I'd hired to take care of my daughter Melissa's lawn while she and her husband Bradley were out of town. They were in Aspen for some real estate conference, rubbing elbows with the kind of people who think a weekend getaway should cost more than a reliable truck. Tyler's voice was shaking. It wasn't the kind of nervous you hear when a kid accidentally clips a sprinkler head or runs over a prized rose bush. It was a raw, primal kind of fear, a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of something deeply wrong. "Mr. Caldwell," he stammered, his words rushing out in a terrified stream. I was trimming near the back by the foundation vents. I heard something." "Slow down, Tyler," I said, my voice steady, though a cold knot began to form in my stomach. "What did you hear?" "Crying," he whispered, the word hanging in the air. "It's coming from the basement. I thought it was maybe a TV left on or an animal, but it's not. It sounds like a person. Mr. Caldwell. Somebody is down there." The knot tightened. Melissa and Bradley's house was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property in a highly exclusive, gated community. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected to find trouble, let alone someone crying in a locked basement. I've known Melissa for 38 years. I knew she was ambitious, sometimes ruthless in her business dealings. But this didn't make sense. "Tyler, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into the authoritative tone I used to command a busy job site. "I want you to walk calmly back to your truck. Get in, lock the doors, and do not move. Do not call anyone else. I am on my way." Okay, he breathed, the relief evident in his voice. "I'm going to the truck. Please hurry." I ended the call and stood up. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when you're dealing with structural failures or potential home invasions. I walked into my study, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. I bypassed the family photos, Melissa smiling brightly in her graduation gown, Bradley looking slick and polished at their wedding, and went straight to the heavy steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner. I spun the combination dial with practiced precision. I'm an old-school contractor. I've worked on sites where you had to watch your back just as closely as you watched the blueprints. I don't take chances, and I certainly don't walk into a potentially dangerous situation unarmed. I opened the heavy door, reached past the stacks of important documents and old contracts, and retrieved my licensed Glock. I checked the magazine chambered around and slipped it into the holster at my hip. The drive to Melissa's house took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mind raced, trying to piece together a logical explanation. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe a neighborhood kid had broken in. Maybe it was just a strange echo in the HVAC system. But Tyler's terrified whisper kept playing on a loop in my head. "It sounds like a person, Mr. Caldwell." I pulled into the expansive circular driveway of their modern glass and steel home. The manicured lawn looked pristine, a stark contrast to the dark reality I was about to confront. Tyler's beat-up pickup truck was parked near the curb, the engine running. I saw him sitting inside, pale and wide-eyed. I gave him a curt nod, a silent instruction to stay put, and walked toward the house. I headed straight for the back of the property, moving quietly along the side path, my hand resting instinctively on the cold steel of the Glock. I found the foundation vents Tyler had mentioned. They were heavy-duty reinforced grates partially obscured by neatly trimmed hydrangeas. I knelt down, the damp earth staining the knees of my jeans. I pressed my ear as close to the metal grate as I could. The world around me seemed to fade away, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of the wind in the trees. I focused entirely on the darkness beyond the vent. At first I heard nothing but the low, steady hum of the house's internal systems. Then it came. A sound. Faint, muffled, but unmistakable. It wasn't a mechanical whine or the screech of a trapped animal. It was a rhythmic, choked sobbing. It was the sound of someone who had been crying for a long time. Someone whose energy was fading, whose hope was nearly gone. It was human. And it was coming from inside my daughter's locked basement. The cold knot in my stomach turned to ice. My 38-year-old daughter, the successful real estate investor, the woman whose lavish lifestyle I had helped fund, had a human being locked in her basement while she was sipping champagne in Aspen. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees. The structural engineer in me analyzed the situation. The vents were too small to see through clearly, let alone access. The only way in was through the house. I had a spare key given to me for emergencies. I suppose this qualified. I walked back to the front door, the silence of the affluent neighborhood suddenly feeling oppressive. I slipped the key into the lock, the metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet afternoon. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the pristine, perfectly decorated foyer. The house was immaculate, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla candles and wealth. But beneath that polished veneer, I knew there was a rotting foundation. And I was going to tear it down to find out what was hidden inside. I turned the heavy brass key in the lock of the front door. The deadbolt slid back with a solid, satisfying thud, a sound that usually meant security. Today it felt like I was breaking into a fortress. I pushed the massive oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The house was immaculate, a sprawling testament to modern wealth. Everything was sharp angles, cold marble, and minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. It smelled faintly of vanilla and expensive leather. It was completely silent up here. The thick, insulated walls and double-pane windows blocked out the world entirely. I walked through the foyer, my boots leaving faint traces on the pristine white marble. I did not care. My focus was entirely on the architecture of the space, tracing the layout in my mind to find the fastest route to the basement. I walked past the open-concept living room, past the floating glass staircase, and headed toward the back corridor behind the kitchen. That was where the basement access door was located when I originally reviewed the blueprints for them. I had helped them select this property. I knew the bones of this house. I reached the narrow hallway and stood before the standard interior door leading down. It was a simple hollow-core wood panel painted a sterile white. I gripped the handle, turned it, and pulled it open. A rush of cool, stagnant air greeted me. I flipped the light switch on the wall. A row of recessed LED lights flickered to life, illuminating the wooden stairs descending into the lower level. I took the stairs slowly, one heavy step at a time. The air grew significantly colder with every foot of elevation I dropped. That was my first warning sign. A standard finished basement maintains a relatively consistent temperature, with the rest of the house maybe a few degrees cooler. This felt like walking into a climate-controlled storage facility. The humidity was entirely stripped from the air. I reached the bottom landing and turned the corner, expecting to see the sprawling, unfinished storage area I remembered from the inspection 2 years ago. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. My hand instinctively drifted back down to the holster at my hip. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Standing before me was not a typical basement entry. It was a door, but not one that belonged in any residential home I had ever worked on in my 40 years of construction. It was a commercial-grade solid steel vault door. It was flush-mounted into a reinforced concrete frame. The steel was painted a dull, matte gray, completely devoid of any decorative trim. There was no standard doorknob. In its place was a heavy stainless steel pull handle, and mounted directly above it, set directly into the metal, was a sleek black biometric fingerprint scanner, alongside a digital keypad. I stepped closer, my contractor mind automatically analyzing the structure. I ran my fingers along the seam where the door met the frame. The tolerances were incredibly tight, less than an eighth of an inch. This was not something you buy at a local hardware store and install over a weekend. This was custom fabrication. The hinges were concealed, likely internal ball-bearing mechanisms designed to support hundreds of pounds of solid steel. The frame itself had been retrofitted. I could see the faint, perfectly smoothed lines in the drywall, where the original studs had been torn out and replaced with heavy-gauge steel beams to support the weight of the vault door. Why does a suburban home need a bank vault door in the basement? The cost to purchase and install a system like this would easily exceed $40,000. You do not spend that kind of money to protect old winter coats and holiday decorations. You install a door like this for two reasons. You either want to keep something incredibly valuable locked safely inside, or you want to keep something desperately trying to get out securely trapped. I pressed my ear against the cold, flat surface of the steel. The soundproofing was exceptional. I could barely hear anything through the dense metal. But the silence itself was unnatural. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The weeping I had heard from the outside vent was completely masked here, swallowed by the acoustic engineering of the barrier. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady, but my mind was racing through a dozen dark scenarios. I navigated to Melissa's contact and hit the call button. I tapped the speakerphone icon, wanting my hands free, and held the phone up in the quiet, sterile space of the basement landing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I imagined her in Aspen, surrounded by snow-capped mountains, and wealthy colleagues completely detached from the cold reality standing right in front of me. On the 4th ring, the line clicked open. Immediately, the sounds of a high-end ski lodge spilled from the speaker. I heard the smooth, rhythmic notes of a live jazz band, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the low, confident hum of affluent conversation. Then her voice cut through the background noise. It was bright, cheerful, and dripping with an easy, untroubled confidence. "Hi, Dad. What a surprise. Everything okay back home?" Her tone was so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that for a fraction of a second I questioned my own sanity. I stood there staring at a biometric steel vault door, listening to my daughter sip champagne 1,000 miles away. "Melissa," I kept my voice deliberately flat, stripping away any trace of panic or accusation. "I am standing inside your house. Tyler called me. He was mowing the back lawn, and he got spooked. He said he heard something coming from the basement vents." The jazz music continued to play softly through the phone. I waited for her reaction. I waited for a pause, a stutter, a sudden shift in her breathing, a sign of guilt. Instead, she let out a light, breathy laugh. It was a completely natural, unforced chuckle. "Oh, Dad. Goodness, you scared me for a second. I thought something had flooded, or the alarm tripped." She paused to take a sip of her drink. I could hear the glass touch her lips. "I completely forgot to warn you about that. Tell Tyler not to worry, please. It is just Bradley's new gadget." "A gadget," I repeated, my eyes locked on the digital keypad of the steel door. "Yes." She continued, her voice slipping into that slightly condescending, patient tone she used when explaining technology to her elderly father. "We had a problem with raccoons trying to nest in the HVAC system last month. They were tearing up the insulation. Bradley found this high-tech pest repeller online. He installed it right near the primary intake vent." I remained silent, letting her fill the space. "It is supposed to emit high-frequency ultrasonic waves," Melissa explained smoothly. "But it also has a secondary audio function. It plays an animal distress loop. It simulates the sound of a wounded animal or a predator to scare the raccoons away. It sounds absolutely awful, like someone crying or dying. Bradley warned me it was creepy. The audio loop must be glitching and playing too loudly. Just ignore it, Dad. We will have the pest control company come look at it when we get back on Thursday." I stood in the freezing basement stairwell, absorbing her words. It was an incredibly plausible lie. It was rational, it provided a logical explanation for the sound Tyler heard, and it casually dismissed the need for any further investigation. It was exactly the kind of explanation a busy, slightly annoyed homeowner would give to an overreacting neighbor. "A pest repeller," I said, slowly testing the weight of the words. "Exactly," Melissa replied cheerfully. "I am so sorry you had to drive all the way over there for nothing. But hey, while you are there, could you maybe check if the mail was brought in? I think I am expecting a package." She was steering the conversation away, normalizing the moment. She was good. If I were just a retired old man checking on his daughter's property, I would have accepted the story, grabbed the mail, and driven home feeling slightly foolish for bringing a gun to a raccoon problem. But I am not just an old man. I am a contractor who knows the difference between an audio loop and the organic, desperate rhythm of human lungs drawing breath to cry. And more importantly, I am a contractor looking at a biometric steel vault door that Melissa conveniently failed to mention. "Sure, sweetie," I said, forcing my voice to soften, adopting the persona of the relieved, clueless father she expected me to be. "I will grab the mail on my way out. You two have fun in Aspen. Be safe." "Thanks, Dad. Love you. See you Thursday," she sang out, and the line went dead. The silence of the basement returned heavy and oppressive. I lowered the phone. The lie was perfect. It was designed to end the conversation. But the lie did not explain the reinforced concrete frame. It did not explain the fingerprint scanner. And it certainly did not explain the bone-chilling cold of the air surrounding me. I stared at the steel door for a long time, my thumb tracing the edge of my holster, knowing that whatever was happening inside this house, it had absolutely nothing to do with raccoons. I turned away from the heavy steel door and slowly walked back up the wooden stairs. I flipped the light switch, plunging the descent back into darkness, and pulled the hollow core door shut. It latched with a quiet click, a flimsy facade hiding the fortress below. My boots moved across the pristine white marble of the foyer with measured purpose. I stepped out through the front door into the warm afternoon sun, the sudden heat a stark contrast to the unnatural chill of the basement stairwell. The neighborhood was still draped in its quiet, affluent peace. Tyler was waiting exactly where I had left him, sitting behind the steering wheel of his beat-up pickup truck. His hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. As I approached the driver's side window, he rolled the glass down. His eyes searched my face for an explanation, for some reassurance that the world made sense. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my money clip. I peeled off 3 crisp $100 bills. I folded them once and handed them through the open window. Tyler looked at the money, then back up at me, confusion mixing with his lingering fear. "Take this," I told him, my voice steady and low. "Go home. You did the right thing by calling me, but your job here is done. I do not want you coming back to this property. If anyone asks you mowed the lawn, you packed up your gear and you left. You heard nothing. You saw nothing. Do you understand me?" He swallowed hard, looking down at the cash in his trembling hands. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," he replied softly. "I understand." "Good man," I said. "Now go." I stepped back onto the curb and watched as he put the truck into drive and pulled away, the engine rattling down the quiet suburban street, until he turned the corner and disappeared. I was alone again on the sprawling property. I stood on the manicured grass, staring at the elegant brick facade of my daughter's home. The lie she had told me on the phone played over and over in my mind. A high-tech pest repeller. An audio loop glitching in the ventilation system. It was a good lie for a layman, but I am a man who has spent 40 years constructing buildings from the ground up. I have spent decades calculating load-bearing walls, designing acoustic dampening systems, and analyzing structural integrity. I know how sound travels through physical space. I know the acoustic resonance of concrete, wood, and steel. A digital audio recording, no matter how advanced the speaker system, has a flat mechanical edge. It pushes sound waves uniformly. But what I heard through that vent was entirely different. I heard the wet, ragged intake of breath. I heard the uneven, desperate rhythm of a human diaphragm expanding and contracting. Digital loops do not draw breath. They do not pause to choke on their own despair. My gut instinct, honed by decades of trusting my senses on dangerous construction sites, screamed that my daughter was hiding a terrible reality. I needed physical evidence to ground my suspicion. I walked around the side of the house, my boots crunching softly on the decorative gravel path. I headed toward the utility access panel mounted on the side of the brick exterior. I found the main electrical meter. It was a modern smart meter, the digital display cycling through various readouts of kilowatt hours and current usage. I leaned in close, shielding the screen from the glare of the sun with my hand. I watched the numbers jump and climb at a staggering rate. The power draw was massive. It was not just high for a sunny Tuesday afternoon when no one was supposedly home. It was astronomical. A house this size, even with the air conditioning running and the pool pump active, should draw a predictable baseline of power. The numbers flashing on the screen indicated a continuous, heavy industrial load. This property was pulling enough electricity to run a small server farm or an independent commercial medical facility. The dial was spinning with a velocity that defied any normal residential explanation. It took immense continuous power to run commercial-grade air filtration, heavy environmental controls, and whatever else was operating behind that steel door. I took a step back, my mind automatically converting the electrical data into structural implications. 2 years ago, Melissa had come to me with a detailed pitch. She and Bradley had purchased this property, a historic colonial home that required significant modernization. She had presented me with a portfolio of architectural renderings, showcasing plans for an open-concept living space, a gourmet kitchen extension, and a fully finished basement featuring a home theater and a wine cellar. She asked for my financial help to make the dream a reality. I had wired them $800,000. It was a massive sum, a significant portion of my life savings given freely out of a father's love. I had trusted her vision. But standing here now, analyzing the visible footprint of the house and comparing it to the power being consumed, the math simply did not add up. The structural layout did not align with the investment. $800,000 buys a lot of luxury finishes, but it also buys a lot of hidden infrastructure. It buys reinforced concrete frames. It buys commercial-grade vault doors. It buys independent medical-grade ventilation systems capable of sustaining an isolated environment entirely disconnected from the rest of the house. I had funded a major construction project without ever stepping foot on the site during the building phase, trusting my daughter and my son-in-law to manage the contractors. I walked further back into the yard, turning to look at the rear elevation of the house. The foundation vents were spaced evenly along the base of the brickwork. I knew from the original blueprints that the basement was expansive, running the entire length of the property. But the door I had just seen at the bottom of the stairs only provided access to a fraction of that square footage. The proportions were wrong. The visible basement was a facade, a small staging area meant to conceal a much larger hidden volume of space behind the steel wall. My daughter had not used my money to build a home theater. She had used my life savings to build a fortified, climate-controlled bunker hidden in plain sight. And inside that bunker, someone was crying. The feeling of betrayal began to seep into my bones, a cold, dark realization replacing the warmth of the afternoon sun. I had spent my entire life protecting my family, working tirelessly to ensure my daughter never had to struggle. I had given her absolutely everything she had ever asked for, trusting that the values her mother and I had instilled in her would forever guide her choices. But the woman who had answered the phone today, casually sipping cold champagne in Aspen, and lying to me with such effortless and calculated grace, was completely a total stranger to me. I turned my back on the steel vault and made my way up the wooden stairs. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was operating with a cold, mechanical precision. I flipped the light switch, plunging the stairwell back into darkness, and closed the simple, hollow core door. It latched with a soft click, a flimsy wooden mask hiding a fortified nightmare. I walked through the pristine kitchen, my boots making no sound on the imported tile. I exited through the front door, locking it behind me, and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. The affluent suburban street was quiet. A neighbor was walking a golden retriever on the opposite sidewalk. A delivery truck rolled slowly around the cul-de-sac. It was a picture of perfect, undisturbed American wealth. And beneath it all, someone was locked in a cage. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. My first instinct, the reflex of any normal citizen, was to reach for my phone and dial the police. I wanted to bring squad cars, tactical units, and heavy breaching equipment to my daughter's front door. I wanted men with badges to cut through that steel and pull whoever was inside into the daylight. My hand hovered over the phone interface on my dashboard. But a colder, harsher logic overrode the impulse. I lowered my hand. Calling the local police was the most dangerous thing I could do. My son-in-law Bradley was not just a wealthy homeowner. He was a senior official at the city planning department. He approved commercial zoning, directed urban development budgets, and signed off on major infrastructure projects. Half the municipal government owed him favors, and the local police precinct relied on the city budget he helped control. Bradley played golf with the chief of police. He hosted charity dinners for the mayor. If I called the local authorities to report a crying sound behind a locked door in his house, the responding officers would immediately notify him. Bradley would have hours to manipulate the situation, move the person, or simply instruct the officers to dismiss the complaint of a confused, overreacting old man. I would be locked out, discredited, and whoever was behind that steel door would vanish. I needed a different approach. I needed someone who operated outside Bradley's sphere of influence, someone who understood the law and knew how to dig through bureaucratic concrete without triggering any alarms. I put the truck in gear, drove 3 blocks away, and pulled into the empty parking lot of a neighborhood park. I turned off the engine, picked up my phone, and dialed a number I had known by heart for 40 years. Mitchell Harding answered on the second ring. Mitchell was my lifelong lawyer, but more importantly, he was my oldest friend. We had navigated divorces, business disputes, and the quiet tragedies of aging together. He was a man built of sharp intellect and ruthless discretion. "Rick," Mitchell said, his voice a familiar gravelly baritone, "to what do I owe the pleasure on a Tuesday afternoon? Are you finally taking my advice about updating your estate plan?" "Mitchell, I need your help, and I need it completely off the official record," I said, my tone deliberately stripping away any casual warmth. "I need you to pull the municipal building permits for Melissa and Bradley's house. I need to know exactly what was filed, what was approved, and who signed off on it. And I need you to do it without leaving a digital footprint that points back to us." The line went silent for a moment. Mitchell did not ask if I was overreacting. He knew me too well for that. He knew I did not deal in dramatics. "What are we looking for, Rick?" he asked quietly. "I funded an $800,000 renovation for them 2 years ago," I explained, staring out through the windshield at the empty park. "I was told it was for a standard basement finish, a home theater, and a wine cellar. I just walked through their house. There is a commercial-grade biometric steel vault door in the basement, and the property is pulling enough electricity to run a small hospital. Whatever they built down there, it is not a wine cellar. I need to know what they put on paper to get the city to allow that kind of heavy infrastructure in a residential zone." "Give me 30 minutes, Mitchell said. "I have a clerk down at Records who owes me her career. I will bypass the standard digital portal and have her pull the raw files directly. Stay where you are." He hung up. I sat in the truck, the engine ticking as it cooled. The 30 minutes felt like an eternity. I leaned my head back against the seat and let my engineering background dissect the situation. To install a biometric vault door, you need reinforced concrete footings. To run whatever was pulling that much power, you need a heavy-duty electrical sub-panel, probably with an independent backup generator. You do not just build a structure like that on a whim. You plan it. You draft blueprints. You calculate load capacities. Melissa and Bradley had taken my money, my life savings, and meticulously engineered a secure facility beneath their kitchen floor. My phone vibrated, shattering the silence of the truck cab. It was Mitchell. I answered immediately. "I have the files," Mitchell said. His voice had lost its usual calm resonance. It sounded strained, tight, with a tension I had rarely heard from him in 4 decades. Rick, this is incredibly disturbing. Tell me, I demanded. First of all, the standard permitting process was completely bypassed, Mitchell explained. The applications were filed, reviewed, and approved on the exact same day. Bradley used his executive clearance at the planning department to rubber stamp his own residential construction permits. He sealed the files under a privacy exemption clause reserved for municipal officials. What did he approve? I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The permit does not mention a home theater or a wine cellar, Mitchell said, reading directly from the documents. The approved architectural variance is for a heavy infrastructure isolation room. The specifications detail 8-inch reinforced concrete retaining walls behind the existing foundation. But that is not the worst part, Rick. Mitchell took a slow breath before continuing. The mechanical permits specify the installation of industrial acoustic soundproofing across the entire lower deck, and the HVAC system is not tied into the main house. The permit specifically approves the installation of an independent medical-grade air filtration and HVAC unit, complete with biological scrubbers and a dedicated oxygen supply line. Rick, this is the exact mechanical profile of a quarantine ward or a private surgical theater. You do not need a medical-grade HVAC system to store old furniture or watch movies. The cold reality washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Acoustic soundproofing, medical-grade air filtration, a biometric steel vault. My daughter had meticulously constructed a soundproof hidden prison beneath her beautiful home. Someone was trapped completely alone down inside, silently weeping. I knew. I did not waste time staring at the blueprints. As soon as I ended the call with Mitchell, I put my truck in gear and drove away from the park. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the suburban streets. I needed a different kind of blueprint now. I needed the digital architecture of that house. Structural concrete and steel were my domain, but the modern world ran on invisible networks. If Bradley had built a medical-grade isolation ward behind a biometric vault, he was not just locking a physical door. He was monitoring it. He was controlling it. And he would have built a digital wall just as thick as the physical one. I made a call to a young man named Logan. Logan was a freelance cybersecurity expert I had met a few years back during a complex commercial build. A disgruntled subcontractor had tried to hold a client's architectural servers hostage, and Logan had bypassed the lockout in under an hour. He was quiet, brilliant, and possessed a flexible understanding of the law when the price was right. More importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. I told him I needed an emergency localized network sweep. I offered him triple his standard hourly rate strictly in cash, and told him to meet me at a diner 2 miles from Melissa's house. We met as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Logan slid into the passenger seat of my truck, carrying a heavy, reinforced backpack. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded, pulled out a heavily modified laptop, and began connecting a series of external antennas and signal receivers. I drove us back into the gated community, the headlights of my truck slicing through the quiet, manicured darkness. I parked the vehicle 2 houses down from Melissa's property, slipping into the shadow of a massive oak tree. From our vantage point, the house looked entirely peaceful. A few automated exterior lights illuminated the brick facade, creating a picture of perfect, undisturbed domestic tranquility. "All right, Logan," I said, keeping my voice low in the quiet cab of the truck. "The target is the white Colonial on the corner. I need to know exactly what kind of digital traffic is moving in and out of that property. Specifically, I am looking for anything routed to the basement." Logan did not reply verbally. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his face bathed in the pale blue glow of the monitor. Lines of code cascaded down the screen in rapid succession. The silence in the truck stretched for 10 minutes, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the keys and the soft hum of the laptop's cooling fan. I watched the house. No lights turned on. No curtains moved. It was an empty shell hiding a terrible secret. "Okay, I am in the primary network," Logan finally whispered, adjusting his glasses. It was a standard high-end consumer router. Nothing special. They have smart thermostats, automated lighting controls, a wireless sound system, and a standard security perimeter setup. It is exactly what you would expect to see in a house like this. I can see the ping history for the last week, mostly streaming services and basic web traffic. Keep digging, I told him. That is the decoy. I guarantee you there is something else. Look for hidden access points or ghost networks. Logan nodded, his brow furrowing in concentration. He opened a new window on his screen and initiated a deeper spectrum analysis. 5 more minutes passed. The quiet of the neighborhood felt oppressive. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting a local patrol car to slowly roll by, but the street remained completely deserted. Suddenly, Logan stopped typing. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. "You were right, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice dropping to a tight, focused register. "There is a massive anomaly here. The primary router is acting as a mask. Hidden beneath the standard home network, there is a secondary, deeply encrypted local area network. It is completely isolated from the smart home devices. It is partitioned off with enterprise-level firewalls. Can you get inside it?" I asked, feeling a cold surge of adrenaline. "It is not going to be easy," Logan muttered, his fingers resuming their rapid dance across the keyboard. "This is not standard off-the-shelf security. This is military-grade encryption. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. They have masked the IP addresses through a series of proxy servers. It is designed to be completely invisible to your average internet service provider sweep." I watched him work, trusting his expertise, while my own mind calculated the implications. A network this secure was not built to protect a hobby or a secret bank account. It was built to protect an ongoing, critical operation. It was built to transmit sensitive data securely without the risk of interception. "Got it." Logan breathed, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. "I found a backdoor in their port configuration. I am bypassing the outer firewall now." "Okay. I am looking at the traffic flow for the isolated LAN." "What are they transmitting?" I asked, leaning over the center console to look at the scrolling data on the screen. "It is a continuous, heavy data stream," Logan explained, pointing to a series of fluctuating graphs. "It is not intermittent like web browsing. It is a constant, steady flow of packets. And it is all being routed out of the house, bypassing the local ISP entirely and transmitting directly to an external offshore server." "Translate that for me, Logan. What kind of data requires that kind of constant, secure stream?" Logan tapped a few keys, isolating a specific data packet. He analyzed the file structure for a long moment. When he looked at me, the pale light of the screen illuminated a look of deep unease on his face. "Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "this is not financial data, and it is not typical home security footage. Based on the packet size, the constant refresh rate, and the specific encryption protocols, this is a live telemetry feed. It is a combination of high-definition continuous video streaming and live biometric data." The words hit me like a physical blow. Biometric data. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir," Logan confirmed, tapping the screen. "You see these overlapping data waves? The larger packets are compressed video and audio feeds. The smaller, highly regular packets are telemetry. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation levels. The kind of data you would see coming from a patient monitor in an intensive care unit. This hidden network is dedicated entirely to monitoring the basement. They have a continuous live medical and visual feed of whoever is down there, and they are broadcasting it to an external server." I stared at the house, the polished brick facade now looking like the walls of a digital prison. They were keeping their captive under constant medical surveillance. The level of cold cruelty required to build this highly engineered system was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Logan did not stop typing. His fingers moved with a frantic, rhythmic intensity across the illuminated keyboard. I sat beside him in the heavy silence of the truck cab, watching the screen as lines of encrypted data shifted and compiled. He was peeling back the digital layers of the offshore server, hunting for the ultimate destination of the medical telemetry feed. It took him another 15 minutes of relentless coding to crack the final proxy shield. When he finally hit the enter key for the last time, A single string of text populated the center of his monitor. It was a corporate registration tag attached to the server hosting account. Logan pointed to the screen, his breathing shallow. The server was not registered to an individual. It belonged to a corporate entity named Silver Pine Transitions Limited Liability Company. I stared at the name, letting it roll through my mind. Silver Pine. It sounded peaceful. It sounded like a luxury resort or a high-end suburban subdivision. But in my line of work, a name is just a facade bolted onto a structure to make it look appealing. I asked Logan if he could find out who owned the company, but he shook his head. He explained that the servers were registered through a blind trust in a jurisdiction that shielded corporate ownership from public digital inquiries. To pierce that veil, I needed legal authority. I needed someone who knew how to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of corporate registries. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone once again. It was getting late, the neighborhood fully surrendered to the quiet of the night, but I did not hesitate to dial Mitchell Harding. He answered almost immediately, his voice sharp and alert, entirely free of the grogginess of sleep. I told him I had a name. I gave him Silver Pine Transitions Limited Liability Company. I asked him to run a complete, exhaustive background check on the entity. I wanted the state of incorporation, the names of the managing partners, the registered agent, and the stated purpose of the business. Mitchell did not ask any questions about how I had obtained the name. He simply told me to give him 10 minutes and hung up the phone. I sat back against the leather seat of my truck, watching the automated security lights of my daughter's house click off, leaving the property draped in shadows. The word transitions echoed in my head. In the real estate business, transitions usually referred to moving properties between portfolios or managing short-term leases. But combined with the live medical telemetry and the biometric vault door in the basement, the word took on a much darker, much more sinister connotation. It implied a movement between stages of life. It implied a forced relocation. My hands clenched into tight fists on my lap. I had spent my life building safe havens for families to grow and thrive. The idea that my own money had been funneled into something designed to trap and monitor a human being was a bitter pill to swallow. I waited in the dark, the silence stretching taut, like a high-tensile steel cable about to snap. When my phone finally vibrated, the sudden noise made Logan jump. I answered the call, bringing the speaker to my ear. Mitchell sounded fundamentally shaken, a rare occurrence for a man who had spent his career battling in cutthroat corporate courtrooms. He told me he had found the company. Silver Pine Transitions was registered in the state of Nevada. Nevada is notoriously friendly to shadow corporations, allowing owners to hide behind layers of legal protection, and registered agents creating a perfect shield for illicit operations. However, Mitchell had bypassed the standard public records and accessed a deeper federal database tied to interstate commerce licensing. He read the business classification aloud. The company was not a real estate holding firm. It was not a property management group. It was officially registered as an elder care and transitioning service. The breath caught in my throat. I asked him to clarify. Mitchell explained that the company was licensed to provide specialized care guardianship management and residential transitioning for senior citizens requiring assisted living. They were legally positioned to take control of an elderly person's life, managing their assets, and determining their living situation under the guise of providing necessary medical and psychological support. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I asked Mitchell the most important question. I asked him who the registered agent was. I asked who held the controlling stake in this Nevada shadow corporation. Mitchell took a slow, deliberate breath. The silence stretched for a fleeting second before he delivered the blow. The sole registered agent, the primary managing director of Silver Pine Transitions, was Melissa Caldwell, my daughter. The revelation dropped onto my chest like an anvil. It crushed the last remaining fragments of hope I had harbored. I had wanted to believe there was a mistake. I had wanted to believe that Bradley was the mastermind, that he had manipulated my daughter into whatever dark enterprise was operating beneath their home. But the corporate documents stripped away that illusion. Melissa was not a victim. She was the architect. I thanked Mitchell, told him to keep the file open, and ended the call. I looked at Logan. He had heard enough of my side of the conversation to understand the gravity of the situation. He quietly closed his laptop and packed his equipment, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere within the truck. I sat absolutely motionless. My mind raced backward, reevaluating the last 3 years of my daughter's life. She had always presented herself as a brilliant, aggressive real estate investor. She boasted about flipping properties, managing high-value portfolios, and securing lucrative commissions. She drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and vacationed in exclusive resorts. I had always assumed her wealth was the byproduct of a ruthless dedication to the housing market. I had been incredibly proud of her business acumen. But it was all a meticulously constructed lie. Her real estate business was nothing more than a front. She was using her position to locate targets. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with horrifying clarity. She found wealthy, isolated individuals. She gained their trust under the pretense of managing their properties or helping them downsize. Then, through silver pine transitions, she systematically seized control of their lives. She was running a shadow corporation designed to exploit the vulnerable. The fortified basement, the medical filtration system, the biometric security. It was not a panic room or a specialized storage unit. It was a private, unregulated holding facility. She was taking elderly people, stripping them of their assets, and locking them away in the dark while she lived a life of absolute luxury right above their heads. The daughter I had raised, the child I had protected and provided for, was a predator. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. The sheer magnitude of her deception was suffocating. She had twisted every value I taught her into a weapon for unimaginable greed. I sat in the darkness of the truck cab, letting the cold reality harden into pure resolve. The timeline was the only advantage we had left. Melissa had told me on the phone that they were not returning from Aspen until Thursday. That gave us roughly 48 hours of an uninterrupted operational window. I looked over at Logan. His face was still illuminated by the fading glow of his laptop screen. I asked him if he was willing to cross a physical line. It is one thing to sit in a vehicle and intercept digital traffic. It is an entirely different legal classification to actively bypass physical security on private property. I told him I would double his fee again, strictly in cash, provided he could get that steel vault door open. He packed his equipment, looked me straight in the eye, and simply nodded. He understood the stakes. We stepped out of the truck and moved silently through the humid night air. The neighborhood was dead quiet. I used my heavy brass key to unlock the front door, slipping inside and disabling the standard perimeter alarm with the code Melissa had casually given me months ago. The house felt entirely different now. The opulent marble flooring, the floating glass staircase, the faint scent of expensive vanilla, all of it felt like a grotesque stage play designed to mask a house of horrors. I guided Logan through the shadowy living room, navigating purely by the moonlight spilling through the large decorative windows, and headed down the narrow back corridor. I pulled open the hollow core door and flipped the switch for the recessed lighting. The unnatural biting chill hit us immediately as we descended the wooden stairs. Logan paused on the bottom landing, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer mass of the commercial-grade steel vault door. He had seen the digital footprint, but standing in front of an 8-inch thick slab of reinforced metal was a deeply sobering reality. He walked closer, his eyes scanning the dull gray surface. He ran his hands along the tight seam where the door met the concrete frame, his fingers tracing the concealed internal hinges and the sleek biometric scanner mounted directly above the heavy stainless steel pull handle. He unzipped his heavy reinforced backpack and began pulling out an array of specialized tools. He set up a portable diagnostic workstation right there on the freezing concrete floor, running a series of optic cables and complex interface shunts. He explained in a hushed whisper that a direct physical breach was absolutely impossible without heavy thermal cutting gear. Cutting through that much solid steel would take hours, and the noise would alert the entire neighborhood. Our only viable entry point was a peripheral bypass of the scanner itself. If he could introduce a highly calibrated localized short circuit into the internal logic board of the biometric reader, he could force the primary locking mechanism to fail in an open state. But there was a significant complication. Logan pointed to a small secondary LED light embedded deep beneath the digital keypad. It was currently dormant, but he warned me it was intrinsically tied to a localized deadman switch within the internal network. Once he physically breached the protective casing of the scanner and interrupted the primary power feed, the system would instantly detect the tampering. It would automatically initiate a secondary silent alarm protocol. That protocol would send a critical distress signal directly to the offshore server we had just found, and would immediately notify Bradley personal devices. Logan looked up at me, his expression grim. He estimated we would have exactly 30 seconds from the moment he pierced the outer casing to completely bypass the internal logic board and scramble the outbound distress signal. If he failed to intercept the signal within that 30-second window, the system would go into a permanent lockdown mode. It would automatically engage a series of secondary internal mechanical deadbolts that not even a thermal lance could easily defeat. We would be permanently locked out, and Bradley would know someone was in his basement. I nodded, indicating my understanding of the risk. I told him to proceed. Logan took a steadying breath. He used a specialized micro-drill to meticulously penetrate the hardened plastic shell of the biometric reader. He worked with agonizing slowness, ensuring he did not damage the delicate components inside. Once he breached the shell, he inserted a hair-thin fiber optic camera to visually locate the primary data ribbon. He connected a small custom-built peripheral bypass module to the side of the scanner using a magnetic shunt. He held a secondary digital interface pad in his left hand, his thumb hovering over the execution sequence. He looked at me one last time. I gave him a curt nod. Logan pressed the button. Instantly, the small dormant LED light beneath the keypad flashed a violent, rapid red. The 30-second countdown had begun. The silence in the freezing basement became suffocating heavy with an agonizing tension that made my chest ache. Logan began typing furiously on his interface pad, running a brutal brute force script designed to overload the logic board. 5 seconds passed. The red light continued to pulse, a silent siren marking our dwindling window. 10 seconds. Logan adjusted the magnetic shunt, cursing softly under his breath as the system actively fought his intrusion. My hands rested on my hips, my muscles coiled tight. I watched the red light flash. 15 seconds. Half of our time was gone. I imagined the digital distress signal racing through the hidden local area network, pushing against the firewall Logan had temporarily erected. 20 seconds. Logan was sweating despite the freezing ambient temperature of the room. His fingers flew across the tiny keypad, injecting false authorization protocols directly into the scanner memory bank. 25 seconds. The red light was flashing so fast, it was almost a solid, terrifying blur of crimson. I braced myself for the sound of the secondary mechanical deadbolts sliding into place, preparing for the bitter reality of absolute failure. I imagined my daughter receiving the notification in Aspen, her terrible secret remaining safe behind a wall of impenetrable steel. 28 seconds. Logan hit the final execution command and slammed his hand down on the bypass module. The flashing red light instantly died. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. The basement was completely silent. I stopped breathing, staring at the dull gray metal, waiting for the heavy thud of the lockdown mechanism. Instead, a deep resonant click echoed from within the door. It was followed by a heavy mechanical clunk, a sound of absolute victory. The massive steel door gently unlocked. The digital display mounted on the scanner flickered briefly before turning a bright, steady green. The system had officially failed open. We had successfully bypassed the vault. Logan let out a long, trembling exhale, sagging slightly against the concrete wall. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy stainless steel pull handle. I pulled it backward. The massive steel barrier smoothly swung open, revealing the horrible truth hidden deep inside the dark isolation room. The heavy steel door groaned as it swung open, the massive concealed hinges gliding with a disturbing, oiled smoothness. A sudden rush of freezing air spilled out from the darkness, biting at my face and chest with an aggressive intensity. It was not just cold. It carried the sharp, unmistakable stench of industrial medical antiseptics, rubbing alcohol, and something faintly sweet and decaying that I could not immediately identify. I stepped across the thick steel threshold, and as my boots touched the pristine, seamless, epoxy-coated floor, inside motion sensors detected my presence. A row of harsh fluorescent overhead lights flickered to life, violently illuminating the cavernous space. I stood completely frozen, my eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden, blinding, sterile brightness. The sheer scale of the engineering before me was absolutely staggering. The entire lower level of the historic colonial house had been meticulously hollowed out, reinforced, and rebuilt into a state-of-the-art, isolated medical ward. The walls were completely paneled with thick, dense sound, absorbing acoustic foam, entirely eliminating the natural echoes of a residential basement. The heavy silence, aside from the low, constant hum of the massive industrial ventilation system, was absolute and terrifying. I moved further into the room, my contractor mind automatically taking a grim inventory of the horrific infrastructure my life savings had funded. The electrical wiring was perfectly organized, housed in exposed, heavy-gauge steel conduits that ran along the ceiling. The medical-grade HVAC system fed into specialized, highly filtered vents positioned directly above 3 distinct separated stations. 3 fully equipped automated hospital beds were spaced evenly across the center of the room. Beside each bed stood a stainless steel tray table, an adjustable intravenous drip stand, and a complex digital vitals monitor, exactly like the highly calibrated machines I had seen in cardiac intensive care units. 2 of the beds were completely empty. Their mattresses were stripped bare, the thick, clear plastic sanitary covers gleaming under the unforgiving fluorescent lights. The monitors beside them were powered down, their dark glass screens reflecting the sterile, empty environment. I walked slowly past the first empty bed, my stomach churning with the horrifying implications. Melissa had built this underground facility with expansion and volume in mind. She had specifically engineered a private holding ward capable of processing and sustaining multiple victims simultaneously. Silver Pine Transitions was not a small, isolated scam operated by a greedy real estate agent. It was a calculated, highly organized industrial-scale operation explicitly designed to harvest human lives. Then the sound hit me again. It was no longer muffled by complex ventilation ducts or thick, soundproofed steel doors. It was raw, immediate, and utterly heartbreaking in its clarity. It was the sound of quiet, exhausted, unbroken weeping. I turned my attention away from the empty stations toward the far corner of the room to the 3rd hospital bed. The pale green privacy curtain was drawn back, revealing a small, fragile shape, huddled defensively beneath a thin, generic white cotton blanket. The digital vitals monitor beside the bed was active, casting a pale, rhythmic green glow across the darkened corner, displaying a steady pulse and an elevated heart rate. The crying was coming from beneath that blanket. It was a continuous, rhythmic whimpering, the awful sound of someone who had been crying for so long that it had simply become their natural, involuntary method of drawing breath. I felt a massive surge of nausea and profound, blinding rage crash over me. I had to force my heavy legs to move to cross the remaining distance toward the occupied bed. My boots felt like they were made of solid lead, dragging across the smooth, polished epoxy floor as I approached the terrifying reality of my daughter's business. I stopped at the foot of the bed. The air here was even colder, pouring directly down from the specialized ceiling vent. I reached out with a trembling right hand and gently pulled the thin white blanket back. Lying in the bed was a frail elderly woman. She could not have been more than 80 years old. Her fine silver hair was thin and matted with sweat against her pale scalp. Her skin was incredibly fragile, almost translucent in the harsh overhead light, stretched painfully tight across her prominent cheekbones. She was wearing a standard faded hospital gown. A thick padded leather restraint secured her left wrist tightly to the metal safety railing of the bed, preventing her from reaching the intravenous line taped securely to the back of her bruised right hand. The clear plastic tubing snaked up to a bag of transparent fluid hanging from the metal stand, slowly and methodically dripping unknown chemicals into her frail resting veins. The continuous telemetry feed Logan had intercepted upstairs was actively monitoring her every single heartbeat, transmitting her physical decline to a secure offshore server, while my daughter vacationed in the snowy mountains of Aspen. The elderly woman blinked, her pale, watery blue eyes squinting against the sudden intrusion of the bright overhead lights. She looked up at me, her fragile expression, a devastating mixture of profound confusion and absolute unfiltered terror. She shrank back violently against the stiff pillows, pulling her unrestrained arm across her chest in a desperate, futile gesture of self-protection. She opened her dry mouth to speak, but her dehydrated throat produced only a dry, raspy, whistling wheeze. I raised both of my hands slowly, keeping my palms open and visible to show her that I meant absolutely no harm. I leaned down slightly, lowering my voice to the softest, most reassuring tone I could possibly manage in that nightmare. I told her that she was safe now that I was not there to hurt her, and that I was going to get her out of this terrible place. The woman merely stared at me, fresh tears spilling over her pale eyelashes and cutting clean, wet tracks down her dusty, sunken cheeks. She did not believe me. Why would she? She had been locked away in a freezing, soundproofed vault, completely stripped of her identity and tethered to humming machines by people who smiled warmly and promised to care for her. I looked at the padded leather restraint binding her frail wrist, and a sickening realization took hold of my mind. My money, the $800,000 I had wired to Melissa with immense pride, had paid for that leather strap. My life savings had purchased the heavy steel vault door that kept her permanently trapped. I had unknowingly funded the construction of this pristine, highly technological dungeon. The beautiful architectural layout I had helped review had actually been a blueprint for an illegal elder abuse black site. I stood in the freezing, sterile air of the medical ward, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the digital vitals monitor and the soft, unbroken weeping of the captive woman. I knew that simply rescuing her would never be enough to wash the deep stain of guilt from my own aging hands. I had to utterly destroy everything my daughter had built. I gently placed my hand over her trembling fingers and vowed absolute, ruthless vengeance today. I slowly withdrew my hand from hers, acutely aware of the rough calluses on my own palms compared to the paper-thin delicacy of her skin. She flinched slightly as I moved a microscopic tremor that traveled up her frail arm and vibrated against the heavy railing of the hospital bed. I leaned closer, examining the method of her captivity with the cold, analytical eye of an engineer inspecting a structural failure. The restraint binding her wrist was not a crude rope or a pair of metal handcuffs. It was a soft, thick medical restraint lined with an expensive blue fleece and secured with industrial-strength Velcro and hidden composite buckles. It was meticulously designed to prevent chafing, tearing, or any visible bruising on the skin. It was a horrifying testament to the calculated nature of this entire operation. Melissa and her associates were not just imprisoning people. They were preserving them. They were ensuring their captives remained physically unblemished to avoid arousing any suspicion from external medical examiners or sudden legal inquiries should the need ever arise to present the illusion of legitimate care. The restraint was tight enough to cut off capillary circulation if she fought it, but the terrifying truth was that she had completely stopped fighting. I followed the clear plastic tubing that snaked out from beneath the thick padding of the restraint. The line ran over the gleaming metal safety rail and curled upward toward the digital intravenous pump mounted on the stainless steel pole beside the bed. I stepped around the monitor, and squinted at the heavy transparent fluid dripping methodically into the central chamber. There was a faded medical label slapped hastily onto the side of the hanging bag. The text was small and highly abbreviated, but my eyes caught the familiar heavy syllables of pharmaceutical sedatives. This was not hydration. This was a continuous, carefully measured drip of powerful narcotics. My daughter was chemically subduing this woman, keeping her locked in a permanent hazy twilight between waking consciousness and forced sleep. The steady rhythm of the machine, a soft mechanical click, accompanied by the slow fall of a single droplet, felt like the ticking of a horrific metronome counting down the final hours of this woman's stolen life. The sedative was heavy enough to completely paralyze her vocal cords and strip away her motor functions, yet precisely measured to keep her cardiovascular system functioning just enough to broadcast stable telemetry back to that offshore server. I looked back down at her face. The harsh, sterile light from the ceiling panels washed out any remaining color in her cheeks, rendering her features as pale and still as carved marble. But her eyes were open. They were heavily clouded, obscured by the thick, narcotic fog of the intravenous drip. But beneath that chemical haze burned a profound, inescapable terror. She looked up at me with a gaze that shattered whatever remained of my heart. It was a look of pure, primal desperation. Her pupils were dilated, struggling to focus on my face, searching my weathered features for any sign of genuine salvation. She could not speak. The drugs and the sheer exhausting weight of her captivity had stolen her voice, leaving her only with the ability to communicate through the silent, frantic shifting of her watery eyes. She was pleading for her life without making a single sound. I could see the agonizing history of her imprisonment, written in the fearful twitch of her jaw and the shallow, uneven rise and fall of her chest. She was begging me not to leave her in this freezing, soundproofed tomb. The contrast between the horrific scene in this subterranean medical ward and the pristine, luxurious life Melissa flaunted upstairs made me physically nauseous. I thought about the expensive imported marble in the foyer, the floating glass staircase, the champagne she was currently drinking in Aspen. Every single luxury, every lavish vacation, every piece of designer clothing was paid for with the stolen assets of the vulnerable people she buried down here. Silver Pine Transitions was not an elder care agency. It was a highly efficient corporate slaughterhouse. Melissa and Bradley had engineered a system to locate isolated wealthy seniors, legally strip them of their autonomy through fraudulent guardianship proceedings, and drain their estates dry. Once the legal transition was complete, the victims were transported to this hidden facility, strapped to a bed and pumped full of heavy sedatives until their bodies eventually surrendered. It was a bloodless bureaucratic murder, executed with the cold, sterile efficiency of a spreadsheet. And I, the proud, hard-working father, had unwittingly poured my life savings into pouring the concrete and hanging the steel that made this nightmare entirely possible for them. I had to get her out. The urge to simply scoop her frail body into my arms and carry her up the stairs and out the front door was overwhelming. But the digital monitor humming beside the bed warned me against any rash, impulsive actions. Logan had explicitly stated that the telemetry feed was live and continuously streaming her vital signs to an external server. If I pulled the intravenous line from her hand, or if I forcefully detached the adhesive biometric sensors stuck to her chest and wrists, the sudden dramatic spike or drop in her medical data would immediately trigger an automated alarm. The system would instantly alert whoever was monitoring the feed on the other end, and Bradley would know that the facility had been fundamentally compromised. I could not risk a secondary lockdown or a dispatched private security response. I needed to disconnect her safely, simulating a stable, continuous reading while we made our physical escape. I leaned down closer to her, ensuring my shadow blocked the harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights from her sensitive, dilated eyes. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm. I told her my name in a steady, rhythmic murmur designed to penetrate the dense fog of the heavy sedatives clouding her mind. I told her that I was a father who had made a terrible mistake, but that I was here to correct it right now. I did not know if she could fully comprehend the words I was speaking, or if the drugs had reduced her understanding to mere tones and vibrations, but I saw a faint, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. The sheer blinding panic in her gaze softened for a fleeting fraction of a second, replaced by a cautious, fragile spark of disbelief. She blinked slowly, the effort clearly exhausting her limited reserves of energy. Her unrestrained hand, the one not tethered to the cold metal safety railing, twitched weakly against the thin white cotton blanket. I gently placed my hand over hers again, offering the only physical comfort I could provide in a room designed to strip away all human dignity. The silence of the isolation ward pressed in on us, heavy and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hissing of the medical-grade air filtration system. I stood up straight, carefully releasing the elderly woman's trembling hand. I offered her one final reassuring nod, a silent promise that I would definitely return. I stepped back from the hospital bed, my chest rising with heavy breaths. I needed to memorize every detail of this room before Logan and I made our exit. I forced my eyes back to the fragile woman strapped to the safety railing. The harsh fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across her sunken cheeks. She stared at me with desperate intensity, her cloudy, narcotic-laced eyes tracking my movement. I looked at those eyes. Beneath the terrifying glaze of heavy sedatives, there was a piercing shade of pale, watery blue. It triggered a violent spark of recognition deep within my mind. My breath caught. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to hers, ignoring the biting chill of the air filtration system. I studied the underlying bone structure of her face, mentally stripping away the brutal effects of malnourishment and chemical sedation. I looked at the familiar curve of her jawline. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with concussive force. My heart hammered against my ribs in absolute horror. I knew this woman. She was not an anonymous victim selected at random. Lying before me, strapped to a bed in my daughter's subterranean medical prison, was Mrs. Evelyn Gable. Mrs. Gable had been my high school history teacher. 40 years ago, she stood at the front of a crowded classroom, a vibrant presence with an absolute passion for education. She had forced me to stay after school when I was a distracted teenager. She patiently explained the architectural history of the Great Depression, connecting facts to the buildings I wanted to construct. She believed in me. She was a woman of immense dignity and profound kindness. Now she was reduced to a withered, terrified captive, stripped of her identity and pumped full of narcotics in a freezing, soundproofed room. The tragedy of her personal life made the situation infinitely more despicable. Mrs. Gable was widowed in her late 30s. Her husband died in a boating accident, leaving her with a massive estate on the affluent north side of the city. They had never been blessed with children. She dedicated her life to her students, pouring her wealth into local charities. She was a solitary, wealthy, entirely independent woman with absolutely no immediate family. She was the absolute perfect target for a financial predator. A memory from exactly 2 years ago rushed to the forefront of my mind, turning my blood to ice. I remembered sitting on the back patio of my home holding a warm mug of coffee. Melissa had come over for a surprise visit. Dressed in an expensive designer suit, she proudly told me about her latest triumph in the competitive real estate market. She casually mentioned securing the exclusive listing for the old Gable estate. I remembered asking her about Mrs. Gable, fondly recalling my old teacher. Melissa looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of deep sympathetic sorrow. She sighed heavily, shaking her head with an expertly acted display of genuine compassion. She told me Mrs. Gable was suffering from rapid, severe onset dementia. She claimed the poor woman could no longer safely navigate the massive house alone. Melissa proudly explained that she had personally stepped in to manage the difficult situation. She utilized her extensive professional connections to expedite a complex legal transition. She claimed she helped liquidate the estate and transition Mrs. Gable into an exclusive luxury nursing facility down in sunny Boca Raton, Florida. She spun a beautiful, comforting narrative about how happy and safe Mrs. Gable was going to be, surrounded by top-tier medical professionals and warm ocean breezes. I praised my daughter that morning. I hugged her and told her how incredibly proud I was of her dedication to helping vulnerable members of our community. The memory of that hug now made me want to violently scrub my own skin. There was no luxury facility in Boca Raton, Florida. There never had been. Melissa had not helped an elderly woman transition to a better life. She used her real estate credentials to identify a wealthy childless widow. She likely forged medical documents to secure a fraudulent diagnosis of severe dementia. She used that fake diagnosis to legally seize control of Mrs. Gable's life and her sprawling estate. She sold the property, pocketed the millions of dollars in profit, and transported my beloved teacher to this freezing, heavily fortified basement. My daughter had buried her alive to slowly drain her remaining financial assets, under the horrific guise of constant medical supervision. I looked down at Mrs. Gable. The profound cruelty of the situation was entirely suffocating. The woman who had taught me the value of human dignity was now a prisoner to my own flesh and blood. I gently reached out and rested my calloused hand on her trembling shoulder. I leaned down until my lips were only inches from her ear. I spoke slowly, ensuring my voice carried the absolute weight of a sworn oath. "Mrs. Gable," I whispered, fighting the thick emotional knot forming in my dry throat. "It is Rick Caldwell. You taught me history 40 years ago. I am going to leave this room right now, but I swear to God Almighty I am coming back for you. I am going to burn this entire house to the ground, and I am going to get you out." Her cloudy blue eyes widened. The frantic, terrified twitching of her jaw finally stopped. A single profound tear escaped the corner of her eye and rolled slowly down her pale cheek, soaking into the pristine white pillowcase. I did not know if she fully understood my specific words, but she clearly understood the absolute resolve in my tone. She squeezed her eyes shut, a silent acknowledgement of the promise I had just made. I turned away from the bed. I signaled to Logan, who was standing frozen near the heavy steel doorway, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He had heard enough to understand the absolute depravity of the situation. He quickly packed his workstation, securing a copied file named Quang Mao 1_17.docs inside his heavy reinforced bag. We moved toward the exit, crossing the floor with swift steps. We stepped past the threshold, having also secured a secondary ledger named Quang Mao 2_17.docsx from the terminal. Logan engaged the peripheral bypass module one final time, forcing the massive vault door to slowly swing shut. It sealed with a heavy final mechanical thunk, locking Mrs. Gable back into her freezing, silent nightmare. We ascended the wooden stairs in total darkness, my mind operating with a terrifying, singular focus. I was no longer just a father dealing with a profoundly disappointing child. I was a man going to war. Melissa and Bradley believed they were completely untouchable. They believed their vast wealth and political connections would forever shield them from any real consequences. They were entirely wrong. I was going to tear down their luxurious life brick by brick. I was going to expose the monster hiding beneath her beautiful face. I stepped out of the front door and locked it behind me, letting the cool night air wash over my face. The game had officially changed. I stepped out of the front door and locked it behind me, letting the cool night air wash over my face. The game had officially changed. I walked toward my truck where Logan was booting up his encrypted drive, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Digital evidence was a powerful tool, but in a court of law, a clever defense attorney could argue that digital files were fabricated, hacked, or manipulated. I needed the raw, undeniable weight of physical paper. I needed ink signatures, stamped notary seals, and original municipal letterheads. I turned sharply on my heel, marched back up the pristine concrete walkway, and used my key to unlock the front door for a second time. I moved quickly through the silent, opulent foyer, bypassing the basement corridor and heading directly toward the eastern wing of the ground floor. Bradley maintained a private study there, a room Melissa had proudly shown me during the initial construction phase. I pushed the heavy oak door open and turned on a small brass desk lamp. The room was immaculate, lined with dark mahogany shelves and smelling of expensive leather. My eyes immediately locked onto a tall, reinforced steel filing cabinet sitting quietly in the far corner of the room. It was secured with a heavy combination padlock, an industrial model that looked completely out of place in such a luxurious residential setting. I did not have the time or the patience for finesse. I walked over to the stone fireplace, grabbed a heavy solid iron poker from the hearth set, and returned to the cabinet. I wedged the flattened tip of the iron poker behind the hasp of the padlock, braced my boots against the wall for maximum leverage, and violently wrenched the metal bar backward. The lock groaned, the steel housing warping under the immense physical pressure until the internal pins finally shattered with a sharp, echoing crack. The padlock dropped heavily onto the thick carpet. I threw the iron poker aside and yanked the top drawer open. The drawer was meticulously organized, filled with thick, color-coded manila folders. I reached in and pulled out a stack of documents, spreading them across the wide expanse of Bradley's polished mahogany desk. The ambient light from the small brass lamp illuminated the terrible mechanics of their criminal enterprise. I opened the first folder. The tab was labeled with a familiar name, a wealthy retired architect I had known by reputation. Inside, I found a complete, comprehensive dossier. There were municipal tax records, detailed property valuation assessments, and highly sensitive banking profiles. But the most damning pieces of paper were the legal documents. I found a stack of durable power of attorney forms, all bearing the architect's shaky, irregular signature alongside the perfectly legible, notarized signature of Melissa Caldwell. She had legally positioned herself as his sole financial and medical proxy. Beneath those forms lay the property deeds. I traced the paper trail, watching a lifetime of wealth systematically dismantled. Melissa had transferred the architect's primary residence, his vacation home, and his liquid investment portfolios directly into the accounts of Silver Pine Transitions Limited Liability Company. I opened another folder, and then another. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying mechanical precision. Every single file contained the exact same sequence of legal manipulation. I was staring at the comprehensive blueprints of a highly organized predatory syndicate. The horrifying business model was entirely exposed on the desk before me, and it relied heavily on Bradley's specific position within the local government. As a senior official at the city planning department, Bradley had unrestricted access to municipal databases. He could pull property tax records, assess home equities, and cross-reference that data with municipal death certificates and demographic census information. He used his executive clearance to identify vulnerable targets. He was specifically searching for elderly citizens who lived alone, who owned high-value real estate free and clear of any mortgages, and who had absolutely no immediate family or active social support networks to check on them. Once Bradley identified the perfect isolated target, Melissa stepped in to execute the second phase of the operation. She utilized her polished professional credentials to pose as a benevolent, highly successful real estate agent specializing in senior transitions. She would approach these vulnerable individuals under the guise of offering helpful, compassionate assistance. She likely offered to help them downsize, promising to manage the complicated logistics of selling their large empty homes and finding them comfortable, luxurious, assisted living facilities. She gained their trust with her warm smile and her endless arsenal of comforting, practiced lies. Once they trusted her, she guided them through a labyrinth of complex legal paperwork. She had them sign away their autonomy, convinced they were simply authorizing a real estate transaction or granting temporary medical proxy. The moment the ink dried on the power of attorney documents, the trap snapped shut. Melissa instantly liquidated their entire estates. She sold their homes, drained their retirement accounts, and legally funneled every single penny into her shadow corporation. But the final, most monstrous phase of their business model involved the fortified basement directly beneath my feet. They did not actually move these people into legitimate nursing homes. Legitimate medical care is incredibly expensive. Paying for round-the-clock nursing staff, physical therapy, and proper residential facilities would severely cut into their massive profit margins. Melissa and Bradley had engineered a method to keep their care costs at absolute zero. They physically transported their victims to the soundproofed medical ward I had just breached. They strapped them to hospital beds and hooked them up to continuous intravenous drips of heavy, paralyzing sedatives. They kept them completely silent, compliant, and hidden from the world. The victims were effectively erased from society, legally alive but physically buried in a sterile dungeon. They required no expensive food entertainment or medical staff. The automated telemetry feed monitored their vitals, ensuring they remained stable enough to avoid triggering immediate death investigations. Melissa and Bradley pocketed millions in stolen assets, financing lavish Aspen vacations, imported cars, and custom renovations with the lifeblood of elderly people trapped downstairs. I stood over the desk, hands shaking uncontrollably, as I held a property deed belonging to Mrs. Gable. The profound realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The $800,000 I proudly wired to my daughter 2 years ago had not been used to build a beautiful home. My money had been used to construct a private, inescapable prison. I purchased the soundproof foam. I funded the steel vault door. I paid for the medical filtration system, pumping freezing air over my captive high school teacher. My life savings had provided the infrastructure for a corporate slaughterhouse. The guilt and rage intertwined, twisting into a hot knot in my chest. I gathered the dossiers, stuffing them into the thick folders. I shoved the highly incriminating evidence firmly under my right arm, turned off the small brass desk lamp, and walked quickly out of the silent study. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire monstrous empire, expose their hidden crimes, and burn their perfect lives straight down to the absolute ground. I walked down the long concrete driveway toward my idling truck, the thick stack of manila folders secured tightly under my right arm. The humid night air did nothing to cool the absolute freezing clarity that had suddenly taken hold of my mind. The profound shock and the paralyzing grief of discovering my daughter's true nature had completely evaporated. In their place was a cold, calculating, and ruthless determination. I was no longer a heartbroken father mourning the loss of his family. I was an architect of retribution. I opened the passenger side door and tossed the heavy folders onto the center console. Logan looked at the files, then up at my face. He did not ask a single question. He simply closed his laptop and waited for my next command. I told him to keep the digital perimeter completely secure and to make sure the offshore telemetry feed continued to transmit a looped simulated signal of stable vital signs. We could not afford any sudden data drops that might alert Melissa and Bradley in Aspen. Logan nodded, his fingers immediately dancing across the keyboard to construct the highly complex digital illusion that would mask our physical presence. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mitchell Harding for the second time that night. It was well past midnight, but he answered on the very first ring, his voice sharp and intensely alert. I did not waste time with pleasantries or vague explanations. I told him exactly what I had found. I detailed the fortified basement, the biometric security, the continuous narcotic intravenous drips, and the devastating presence of my former teacher, Mrs. Gable. I explained the massive paper trail of fraudulent power of attorney documents and stolen property deeds currently sitting on my center console. Mitchell was a hardened corporate litigator who had seen the darkest sides of human greed, but the sheer monstrous scale of this operation left him momentarily speechless. When he finally spoke, his tone was completely devoid of its usual measured legal caution. He told me to stay exactly where I was and to touch absolutely nothing else. He explained that this was no longer a matter for local police or standard civil litigation. The systematic targeting of vulnerable seniors, the interstate financial fraud, and the physical captivity elevated this to a severe federal crisis. Mitchell told me he was bypassing standard channels and contacting the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly, specifically requesting their highly specialized white-collar crime and human trafficking divisions. He promised me that we would have a dedicated extraction team on site within the hour. I ended the call and leaned back against the leather seat of the truck, staring at the darkened facade of the house. The wait was an agonizing exercise in forced patience. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, my mind constantly pulling back to the freezing basement and the fragile woman strapped to that hospital bed. I watched the quiet residential street, my senses hyper-tuned to the slightest shift in the environment. Exactly 45 minutes later, the silence of the neighborhood was broken by the low, synchronized hum of heavy modified engines. Two large, completely unmarked black transit vans rolled smoothly down the street. They drove with their headlights completely extinguished, navigating purely by the ambient glow of the street lamps to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from the sleeping neighbors. They parked directly behind my truck, blocking the driveway with practiced military precision. The heavy sliding doors opened simultaneously. There were no flashing lights, no wailing sirens, and no shouting officers. A team of 10 individuals stepped out into the humid night air. Half of them wore dark tactical gear, with the subtle, unmistakable lettering of the FBI stenciled across their tactical vests. The other half were specialized federal medical personnel carrying compact, highly advanced portable trauma kits and a collapsible heavy-duty transport gurney specifically designed for confined spaces. The lead federal agent, a tall, severe-looking man with sharp eyes and graying hair, approached my window. He asked for my identification and quietly took possession of the manila folders. I handed over the physical evidence, feeling a fraction of the immense burden lift from my shoulders. I quickly briefed him on the layout of the house, the disabled perimeter alarm, and the bypassed vault door in the basement. I led the medical team up the concrete walkway and back through the opulent foyer, guiding them directly toward the hidden corridor. We descended the wooden stairs in absolute disciplined silence. When we reached the open steel vault door, the medical personnel moved in with stunning, silent efficiency. They did not hesitate or express visible shock at the horrific soundproofed ward. They immediately gravitated toward the occupied bed in the far corner. The lead physician, a woman with incredibly gentle hands and a focused demeanor, began a rapid, hushed assessment of Mrs. Gable. She carefully examined the thick leather restraint binding the frail wrist, noting the severe lack of circulation. She analyzed the digital vitals monitor and traced the intravenous line back to the hanging bag of sedatives. She explained in a low whisper that they could not simply rip the needle out. A sudden withdrawal of the heavy narcotics would cause the elderly woman's compromised cardiovascular system to violently crash into a fatal state of shock. They had to execute a highly calibrated chemical titration process right there in the freezing basement to safely stabilize her heart rate before attempting any physical movement. I stood in the shadowed corner of the room watching as the federal medical team worked with absolute focus and precision. They successfully managed the delicate chemical transition, replacing the heavy paralyzing sedatives with stabilizing saline fluids and gentle neutralizing counteragents. It took 20 agonizing minutes of careful monitored chemical balancing before the lead physician finally gave the clear signal to proceed. They carefully unbuckled the soft fleece-lined restraints and gently transferred Mrs. Gable onto the collapsible transport gurney. The elderly woman was still heavily sedated, her pale blue eyes closed in a deep medicated sleep, but her breathing was finally natural, steady, and unforced. She was finally safe from my daughter's monstrous greed. As the medical team prepared to roll the gurney out of the isolation ward, I stopped the lead FBI agent with a firm hand on his shoulder. I pointed to the empty hospital bed, the discarded leather wrist restraints, and the digital vitals monitor that Logan was currently spoofing from the driveway. I looked the agent directly in the eye and delivered a very specific, uncompromising set of instructions. I told him that they needed to leave the medical equipment exactly as it was. They needed to leave the intravenous bag hanging on the tall metal stand. They needed to leave the empty bed perfectly unmade. I wanted Melissa and Bradley to return from their luxurious mountain vacation completely unaware that their private, unregulated prison had been permanently breached. I wanted them to walk down these wooden stairs, confidently open that heavy steel vault door, and step directly into the inescapable, devastating legal trap I was currently building for them in the cold, unyielding shadows of their own home. I watched the unmarked transit vans roll silently back down the long, concrete driveway, carrying Mrs. Gable away from this nightmare. They had handled her with the utmost dignity, treating her not as a piece of discarded human evidence, but as a survivor of a terrible war. The moment their dull red taillights faded into the humid darkness of the neighborhood, the heavy mantle of the rescue operation shifted entirely into the cold, calculated mechanics of the trap. I turned my attention back to Logan. He was already kneeling beside the heavy steel vault door on the bottom landing, his fingers flying across his illuminated diagnostic pad with precise energy. I told him we needed the digital perimeter to be completely flawless. Every single byte of data indicating our physical intrusion had to be eradicated from the local network. He explained in a low, measured whisper that he was currently scrubbing the internal logic board, systematically overwriting the temporary bypass codes with a perfectly clean, seamless log file. He was carefully re-establishing the direct connection to the offshore server, ensuring that the simulated telemetry feed would continue to broadcast the steady, rhythmic vital signs of an elderly woman who was no longer in that bed. To Bradley's remote monitoring applications in Aspen, the basement was exactly as they had left it. It remained a perfectly secure, highly profitable secret. While Logan manipulated the invisible digital realm, I focused my contractor's eye on the physical environment. I walked back into the freezing, sterile medical ward. The silence in the soundproofed room was different now. It was no longer heavy with the agonizing, continuous sound of exhausted weeping. It was just an empty, hollow concrete box lined with thick acoustic foam. I approached the hospital bed in the far corner and carefully smoothed the thin white cotton blanket over the mattress, recreating the exact shape and contours of a resting human body. I adjusted the thick leather wrist restraints, draping them over the metal safety rails precisely as they had been when we first arrived. I checked the digital intravenous pump, ensuring the heavy narcotic fluid was still dripping steadily into a concealed biohazard drain I had quickly fashioned from a spare piece of clear plastic tubing. Everything had to look exactly right at a casual glance. Melissa and Bradley would not look closely. They were too confident in their impenetrable fortress to scrutinize the details of their terrible business. I grabbed a cloth from a stainless steel tray table and wiped down all the smooth metal surfaces, carefully erasing any stray fingerprints I might have left behind during the extraction. I walked backward toward the heavy exit, my eyes scanning the pristine epoxy floor for any scuff marks from the transport gurney. I found absolutely nothing. The room was a perfect, sterile illusion. I stood in the center of the room one last time, letting the freezing air wash over my face. I needed to burn this image into my memory to fuel my resolve. I left the freezing basement and moved directly toward the eastern wing of the ground floor. The dark mahogany study was just as silent and still as I had left it. I carried the heavy stack of manila folders holding the paper trail of forged power of attorney documents and stolen property deeds. I carefully returned the thick folders to their exact chronological order within the heavy steel filing cabinet. I slid the top drawer shut with a metallic click. The violently broken combination padlock lying on the carpet was the only glaring piece of physical damage. I had fully anticipated this complication. From the toolbox in my truck, I had retrieved an identical industrial padlock, a model I frequently used for securing expensive materials on construction gates. I clamped the new lock onto the heavy steel hasp, effectively sealing the cabinet. Unless Bradley specifically attempted to enter his numerical code, he would never visually register that the internal pins of his original lock had been completely shattered and replaced. I turned off the small brass desk lamp and returned to the basement landing. Logan was waiting for me, quietly packing his fiber optic camera and peripheral bypass module back into his reinforced bag. He had snapped the plastic shell of the biometric reader back into its original position, sealing the drill hole with a specialized color-matched epoxy resin that hardened instantly. He stepped back and gave me a sharp nod. The massive vault door was fully armed. The complex biometric scanner was functional. The lethal silent alarm protocol was guarding the empty room. The trap was perfectly set. We walked up the wooden stairs and exited the house, stepping back out into the humid night. The crickets were chirping softly in the bushes, providing a strangely peaceful soundtrack to the absolute destruction I was orchestrating. I needed to coordinate the final phase of the operation with the lead federal agent, who had remained behind in a concealed mobile command vehicle parked 2 quiet blocks away. Through a secure, encrypted radio channel, he confirmed that the specialized tactical extraction team had successfully delivered Mrs. Gable to a secure federal medical facility. He then methodically outlined the current operational perimeter. Unmarked generic sedans and dull utility vehicles were quietly filtering into the upscale neighborhood, blending seamlessly into the affluent, manicured surroundings. Highly trained federal agents were taking up hidden strategic positions behind tall ornamental hedges, inside neighboring empty driveways, and actively monitoring the main access road leading into the private cul-de-sac. The entire luxurious street was now a highly organized, completely invisible net waiting to drop. I thanked the agent for his absolute precision, ended the secure transmission, and walked back up the concrete driveway. I sent Logan home with a final heavy envelope of cash, ensuring his silence and his safety. I unlocked the front door and walked back inside my daughter's beautiful hollow house. I moved slowly into the expansive living room and did not turn on a single overhead light. The heavy, expensive velvet curtains were tightly drawn against the large decorative windows, plunging the enormous space into deep, suffocating shadow. I walked over to the custom-built wet bar in the corner of the room, my boots sinking into the plush designer rug. I picked up a heavy crystal glass and poured myself a generous, burning measure of neat bourbon. I walked over to the large leather armchair positioned perfectly facing the grand front entryway and sat down. The absolute silence of the house settled heavily around my shoulders, thicker than the steel door in the basement. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the amber liquid, letting the sharp alcohol warm the cold, tight knot in my chest. My mind was perfectly clear, stripped of all paternal grief, and focused entirely on the impending consequence. I was no longer a proud father building a legacy for his only child. I was a man who had built a cage, and I was going to sit right here in the suffocating dark, gripping my glass, until the monsters finally came home to claim their prize. The following 48 hours passed with a sluggish, agonizing wait. I remained inside the suffocating perimeter of that beautiful hollow house, acting as the silent guardian of a ruined empire. I did not sleep. The silent wait tested every single fiber of my remaining patience and dwindling physical endurance. My mind was far too active, racing through the meticulously constructed layers of my impending retaliation. I spent the daylight hours coordinating with Mitchell Harding and the federal agents over secure channels, finalizing the legal and tactical framework of the trap. The financial records I had extracted from Bradley's shattered filing cabinet were already in the hands of forensic accountants, who were actively freezing every single corporate asset tied to Silver Pine Transitions. I paced the expansive living room, my boots treading softly over the expensive designer rugs, absorbing the sickening reality that everything surrounding me was purchased with the stolen lives of vulnerable people. As the second night descended, the house grew completely silent once again. I returned to the large leather armchair positioned in the deep shadows facing the grand front entryway. I poured myself one final measure of bourbon, letting the glass rest heavily on my knee. I focused my eyes on the heavy mahogany front door, listening to the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Shortly after 10 in the evening, the distinctive, powerful hum of a high-performance engine broke the quiet of the cul-de-sac. Headlights swept across the front windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced briefly across the walls of the living room. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured, watching as the vehicle parked in the driveway. The heavy thud of car doors closing echoed through the still night air. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Melissa's designer heels walking up the pristine concrete pathway, accompanied by Bradley's heavier, confident stride. They were not attempting to be quiet. They moved with the bold, arrogant assurance of people who believed they completely owned the world. I heard the metallic jingle of keys, followed by the solid click of the deadbolt sliding open. The heavy front door swung inward, letting a brief gust of cool, humid air into the stagnant foyer. They stepped over the threshold, completely oblivious to the predator waiting for them in the dark. Bradley reached out and carelessly tossed his keys onto the marble console table. His voice carried through the foyer, loud and dripping with absolute unfiltered arrogance. He was laughing, a deep, booming sound that made the muscles in my jaw tighten. He told Melissa that the new $5 million acquisition was going to be the easiest transition they had ever executed. He openly bragged about how the target was entirely isolated, with no living relatives, to contest the power of attorney. He proudly stated that the old man practically handed over the keys to his estate the moment they promised him a luxury retirement suite. Melissa laughed in response, a bright, melodic sound that I used to associate with my proudest moments as a father. Now it just sounded like the hissing of a snake. She told Bradley that the profit margins on this new acquisition would easily cover their planned renovations and leave enough left over for a new winter property. They were casually discussing the complete destruction of another human being as if they were reviewing a standard quarterly earnings report. They walked further into the house, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. Bradley reached out to turn on the primary foyer lighting, but his hand froze mid-air. As their eyes slowly adjusted to the deep shadows of the expansive living room, they finally noticed the dark silhouette occupying the large leather armchair. The confident, arrogant laughter died instantly in their throats. The sudden silence that fell over the room was absolute and suffocating. Bradley physically recoiled, taking a sudden step backward toward the open front door, his broad shoulders tensing as he instinctively prepared for a physical confrontation. Melissa stood completely frozen, her expensive designer luggage slipping from her fingers and landing on the marble floor with a heavy, dull thud. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw the raw, unfiltered panic flash across her beautiful face. She realized someone had breached her fortress. But Melissa was a master manipulator, a predator who had spent years perfecting the art of the comforting lie. I watched the panic vanish from her eyes, instantly replaced by a perfectly constructed facade of pleasant surprise. The transition was so smooth, so breathtakingly effortless, that it made my blood run completely cold. She stepped forward, her posture relaxing into an attitude of warm, welcoming affection. She tilted her head slightly, her voice returning to that bright, melodic pitch. She called out to me, asking what I was doing, sitting alone in the dark. She asked if I had come by to check on the broken raccoon repeller near the back deck, a minor household issue she had casually complained about weeks ago. It was a brilliant, highly calculated pivot. She was testing the waters, trying to ascertain if I was just a helpful, clueless father making an unexpected late-night repair visit, or if I had discovered the terrifying truth buried directly beneath my feet. I did not move. I remained perfectly still in the leather armchair, the heavy glass of bourbon resting firmly on my knee. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the oppressive weight of the dark room to press down heavily on them. The facade Melissa had so carefully constructed began to show the faintest hairline fractures as my continued silence fed their growing anxiety. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway that led to the eastern wing, perhaps remembering the highly incriminating dossiers locked inside his study. He cleared his throat, attempting to project a sense of masculine authority, but the subtle tremor in his voice betrayed his escalating fear. He asked me if everything was all right, demanding to know why I had let myself into their home without calling first. I looked at the daughter I had raised, protected, and funded. I looked at the man who had helped her build a corporate slaughterhouse. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, blinding fire. It was an absolute glacial certainty. I slowly raised the crystal glass to my lips, taking one last deliberate swallow of the burning bourbon. I set the empty glass down on the wooden side table with a sharp, resonant clink that echoed loudly through the silent house. I leaned forward, letting the moonlight catch my face, ensuring they could see the absolute absence of mercy in my eyes. I told them I was not there to fix a broken raccoon repeller. I told them I was there to fix a broken foundation, and I was going to start by tearing down the walls they had built around Mrs. Gable. The game was entirely over, and it was time for them to personally pay for every single sin. I watched the color drain completely from my daughter's face as the horrible reality finally hit. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream, and I did not offer them a single ounce of the paternal sorrow they were desperately waiting to see. I remained perfectly seated in the heavy leather armchair, letting the dead silence of the room stretch until it became a physical weight pressing against their chests. Melissa opened her mouth, stammering, trying to construct a new lie, trying to deploy that sweet, manipulative tone she had used to steal millions. She tried to tell me I was confused, that Mrs. Gable was in Florida, that I was simply having a terrible misunderstanding. I did not let her finish the sickening script. I reached into the breast pocket of my heavy jacket and withdrew a thick, folded stack of documents. I leaned forward and dropped them onto the glass surface of the designer coffee table separating us. With a deliberate sweep of my hand, I fanned the items out so they were perfectly visible in the dim, slanting moonlight. The first item was a comprehensive stack of certified financial records. I pointed a single finger at the top page. It was a highly detailed chronological ledger of every single bank transfer routed through Silver Pine Transitions Limited Liability Company. The paperwork clearly outlined the systematic, ruthless liquidation of over a dozen prominent estates. Bradley leaned forward, his eyes tracking the columns of numbers, recognizing his own hidden account, routing codes printed in stark black ink. I watched his chest stop moving. He realized instantly that the absolute secrecy of his shadow corporation had been entirely compromised. I told them the forensic accountants working for the federal government had found the offshore server. They had completely dismantled the digital firewall Logan had breached 2 nights ago. Every single penny they had stolen, every dollar they had funneled away to finance their luxury cars and lavish Aspen vacations, was now fully documented and resting in the hands of federal prosecutors. I slid my finger to the second document. It was a heavy formal piece of legal parchment bearing the undeniable stamped seal of the United States Department of Justice. It was a comprehensive federal asset freeze warrant. I took a slow, measured sip of my neat bourbon, letting the burning liquid coat my throat before I spoke. I explained to my daughter, in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that as of 2 hours ago, every single bank account associated with their names had been completely locked. Their credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. Their investment portfolios were frozen. Their liquid assets were entirely inaccessible. The beautiful, opulent home they were currently standing in was no longer theirs to enjoy. It was now officially classified as the primary staging ground for a massive multi-million-dollar federal racketeering and human trafficking investigation. The wealth they had built by destroying vulnerable human lives had been evaporated by a single judge signature. Melissa began to hyperventilate. Her hands shook violently as she stared at the federal warrant. But it was the third item that finally broke the last remaining pillar of their arrogant delusion. I pushed a freshly printed high-resolution glossy photograph across the glass table. It came to a rest directly in front of Melissa. It was an image taken only hours ago inside a highly secure private federal medical facility. It showed Mrs. Evelyn Gable. She was no longer strapped to a metal safety rail. She was no longer buried in a freezing, soundproofed basement pumped full of paralyzing narcotics. The photograph showed her sitting upright in a warm, brightly lit hospital bed, holding a spoon and eating a bowl of warm broth. She looked frail and she looked exhausted, but she was awake, alert, and entirely safe. The monstrous illusion that Melissa had crafted the lie about a luxury Florida nursing home was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Bradley stared at the photograph, his face turning an absolute sickly shade of chalk white. The arrogant, booming confidence he had paraded into the foyer moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, uncoordinated movements of a cornered animal. He understood the legal implications of that single photograph. It was the undeniable proof of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and severe elder abuse. He realized they were not just facing financial ruin. They were facing decades inside a federal penitentiary. Panic seized his large frame. He aggressively shoved his hand into the pocket of his expensive, tailored suit coat and blindly scrambled for his cell phone. His hands were trembling so badly, he nearly dropped the device onto the marble floor. I watched him frantically stab his thumb against the illuminated screen. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was attempting to activate his corrupt network. He was trying to dial his senior contacts at the city planning department, the powerful insulated bureaucrats who had helped him access the municipal databases to target his wealthy, isolated victims. He believed his political connections could somehow build a wall between him and the crushing weight of the federal government. I let him dial the number. I sat quietly in the heavy leather armchair, holding my crystal glass, and listened to the phone ring on the speaker. It rang once. It rang twice. It rang a third time, echoing loudly into the silent, suffocating tension of the living room. It immediately went to a generic automated voicemail. Bradley cursed loudly, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. He frantically hit the redial button, pacing in a tight, desperate circle near the wet bar. I raised my glass to my lips, took another slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, and set the heavy crystal down on the table with a firm, decisive thud. I looked at Bradley, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. I told him he could stop calling that number. I informed him in a completely flat, clinical tone that his immediate superior, the director of the Municipal Records Division, was currently unavailable. I explained that approximately 20 minutes ago, an armed tactical unit from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had kicked down the front door of his luxury condominium. They had dragged him out of his bed in handcuffs. His corrupt boss was currently sitting in the back of an armored federal transport vehicle, actively brokering a plea deal by surrendering every single name involved in the Silver Pine Transition Syndicate. The realization slammed into Bradley with the force of a speeding train. His knees buckled and he dropped his cell phone. It hit the designer rug with a muffled thud. He looked at Melissa, his eyes wide with inescapable dread. The impenetrable fortress they thought they had constructed was gone. The political favors were useless. The stolen cash was frozen. They had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. Melissa finally fell to her knees right there in the center of the dark living room, her impeccable facade entirely destroyed by reality. I sat back in the leather armchair, looking at the two monsters I had finally brought to complete ruin. I took a steadying breath, waiting for the tactical boots to step through the door and finish the job. The silence in the living room shattered completely with the deafening force of a localized explosion. The heavy mahogany front door was violently kicked inward, the deadbolt tearing entirely through the expensive wooden doorframe with a harsh splintering sound. Simultaneously, the thick glass of the custom patio doors at the back of the house shattered into 1,000 falling pieces. The synchronized breach was a masterpiece of overwhelming physical intimidation. Heavy tactical boots hammered across the marble foyer and the designer hardwood floors. Beams of blinding light from tactical rifles sliced through the darkness, crisscrossing wildly before locking onto their targets. A dozen highly trained federal agents swarmed the open space, moving with a fluid, terrifying aggression that instantly neutralized any possible thought of resistance. Bradley did not have the opportunity to raise his hands. Two massive agents collided with him, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit and spinning his frame around with breathtaking speed. They slammed him face first against the custom drywall. The sheer force knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. His legs instinctively kicked apart, his arms violently wrenched behind his back. The mechanical ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed sharply. His cheek was pressed flat against the drywall, his eyes vacant as an agent leaned close, rapidly reciting the Miranda warning. The corrupt bureaucrat who had orchestrated the ruin of defenseless citizens was reduced to a subjugated prisoner in seconds. The tactical sweep of the house continued with relentless efficiency. Agents secured the eastern wing, breaching the mahogany study to confiscate the steel filing cabinet containing the blueprints of their criminal empire. Another team systematically moved toward the basement corridor, heavily armed, and prepared to secure the fortified biometric vault. The beautiful house my life savings had helped build was being dismantled, transformed from a fortress of stolen wealth into an active federal crime scene. Melissa remained on the floor, her knees pressed into the designer rug. She was completely surrounded by the chaotic vortex of flashing tactical lights and shouting federal agents. The perfectly constructed arrogance that had defined her adult life had evaporated. She was trembling violently, her chest heaving with panicked breaths as she stared at the barrel of a rifle pointed squarely at her chest. Two agents approached her, their expressions hard and unforgiving. They ordered her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. In that final moment, my daughter looked away from the approaching agents and turned her tear-streaked face toward me. The panic in her eyes shifted into a raw pleading. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp commands of the tactical unit. She closed the distance between us and lunged forward, her manicured hands desperately grabbing the fabric of my pant leg. Her grip was astonishingly tight, her knuckles turning white. She looked up at my face, her styled hair falling wildly across her wet cheeks. She began to cry hysterically, the sound tearing through the chaotic living room. She begged me to call them off. She pleaded with me to explain to the agents that this was all a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding we could resolve as a family. Her voice rose into an agonizing shriek as the agents stepped closer to pull her away. She screamed the words with every ounce of air left in her lungs. "Dad, please, stop them. I am your daughter." I sat still in the heavy leather armchair. I looked down at the woman gripping my leg. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of paternal affection, any small spark of mercy for the child I had raised, protected and loved more than my own life. I found absolutely nothing. The void inside my chest was completely cold, sterile, and entirely unyielding. I did not see a terrified daughter begging for salvation. I saw a ruthless, calculating monster who had chained a fragile, defenseless elderly woman to a hospital bed in a freezing, soundproofed dungeon. I saw the architect of a corporate slaughterhouse crying only because her perfect stolen world had finally collapsed. I slowly reached down and firmly grasped her wrists. I did not use excessive force, but my grip was absolutely unyielding. I peeled her desperate fingers away from the fabric of my pants. I pushed her hands away and calmly stood up from the leather armchair, towering over her kneeling, trembling form. I looked down at her tear-streaked face with absolute freezing, zero emotion. My voice was completely flat, slicing through the shouting federal agents and the flashing tactical lights with devastating clarity. I told her that I came here tonight to visit my favorite high school teacher. I told her that I have no daughter. Melissa's eyes widened in absolute horrifying realization. The final agonizing scream that tore from her throat was not a plea for mercy. It was the devastating sound of total, inescapable condemnation. I took a deliberate step backward, completely removing myself from her reach. I turned my back on her just as the two federal agents aggressively grabbed her arms, hauling her violently up from the floor. They forced her wrists behind her back, the steel handcuffs snapping shut with a brutal, satisfying finality. She thrashed and wailed against their grip, but her expensive designer heels slipped uselessly against the marble floor as they began to drag her toward the shattered front entrance. I did not look back. I buttoned my heavy jacket and walked slowly toward the ruined front door. The federal agents stepped aside to let me pass, their expressions reflecting a quiet, respectful understanding of the absolute devastation I had just orchestrated. I stepped over the splintered remains of the mahogany doorframe and walked out onto the pristine concrete pathway. The humid, heavy night air hit my face, smelling faintly of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The quiet street was completely transformed. Red and blue emergency lights flashed silently in the dark, illuminating the manicured lawns. Dozens of federal cruisers blocked the entire cul-de-sac. Uniformed officers were establishing a secure perimeter, pushing back the curious neighbors who had stepped out onto their porches. I walked steadily down the driveway, the crunch of my boots on the concrete providing a steady rhythm. The wailing sounds of my former daughter being forced into a heavily armored federal transport van echoed briefly into the night before the heavy metal doors were slammed shut, cutting off her screams forever. I reached my truck and placed my hand on the door handle. The physical exhaustion of the last 48 hours finally began to settle deep into my bones. I opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat, shutting out the flashing lights and the frantic federal activity. I gripped the leather steering wheel, taking one last long, final look at the hollow house I had helped build. The monsters had finally been caged. The stolen foundation had been completely torn down. The profound silence of the cab wrapped around me as I put the heavy diesel truck into gear and drove slowly away into the dark, completely alone, but finally at absolute peace. 6 months passed since that humid night, sweeping away the wreckage of my former life and replacing it with the cold, sterile reality of the federal justice system. The legal fallout was absolute and devastating, matching the ruthless efficiency of the syndicate my daughter had helped orchestrate. I sat quietly in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse, watching the final sentencing play out. Melissa and Bradley stood before the stern federal judge, stripped of their tailored designer suits and their expensive arrogance, wearing only the dull, identical fabric of federal inmates. The sheer gravity of their crimes echoed through the courtroom, silencing any possibility of leniency. The prosecution successfully demonstrated that this was not merely a financial scheme, but a highly sophisticated predatory ring designed to completely erase human beings from society. The mountains of irrefutable evidence I had provided, from the meticulously forged property deeds to the horrifying medical telemetry logs, left their high-priced defense attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver. The judge handed down 25-year sentences without the possibility of parole. Their convictions covered multiple counts of aggravated kidnapping, interstate wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. When the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block, Melissa did not turn back to look at me. She simply lowered her head, finally breaking under the crushing, inescapable weight of her own monstrous actions. The government moved with an equally ruthless speed to dismantle the physical remnants of their empire. The beautiful Lincoln Park house, the structure I had so proudly funded with my life savings, was immediately seized and liquidated at a federal auction. Every luxury vehicle, offshore bank account, and offshore investment portfolio tied to Silver Pine Transitions was confiscated. The swift, decisive action of the federal agencies ensured that no hidden accounts or buried offshore assets remained untouched. Every trace of their arrogance was systematically erased from the financial system, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the stark, terrifying reality of their incredibly long sentences. Through the meticulous efforts of Mitchell Harding, I was legally classified as a defrauded investor. The federal courts systematically recovered and returned the original $800,000 I had unknowingly contributed to their enterprise. But that money no longer felt like a simple retirement fund. It felt like an obligation. I combined my recovered savings with a substantial portion of the restored assets belonging to Mrs. Gable and several other surviving victims who wished to see lasting change. Together, we launched a powerful legal nonprofit organization strictly dedicated to investigating and aggressively auditing elder care guardianships. We hired a brilliant team of forensic accountants and ruthless litigators whose sole purpose was to hunt down and dismantle predatory syndicates before they could bury another vulnerable citizen in a soundproofed basement. I stood alone in the bright, bustling office of our new foundation, looking out through the large glass windows at the busy city street below. The air was filled with the energetic sounds of our legal team answering phones and drafting comprehensive audit requests. I placed my hands on the smooth surface of my desk, letting the steady rhythm of the office wash over me. I searched my heart one final time, expecting to find some lingering shadow of grief for the daughter I had permanently lost to the federal prison system. I looked for the familiar agonizing ache of a broken father mourning his only child. I found absolutely nothing. The void left by Melissa's betrayal had been completely filled by a profound, unyielding sense of purpose. I felt no sorrow for the architect of that freezing, sterile dungeon. I only felt a deep, sustaining peace for the innocent lives we were actively saving every single day. I had completely torn down a terrifying prison, and from its shattered, broken foundation, I had finally built a true, enduring, strong, and lasting legacy. There is a dangerous misconception that sharing DNA automatically equates to sharing a moral compass. It simply does not. Evil does not always wear a terrifying mask of physical violence. Sometimes it wears a tailored designer suit and a bright, familial smile. When your deep intuition screams that something is terribly wrong, never let the easy comfort of a lie silence the harshness of the absolute truth. We are defined not by the bloodlines we blindly protect, but by the innocent lives we refuse to look away from. Integrity requires us to stand against cruelty, even right at home. If my story opened your eyes to the harsh realities hidden behind closed doors, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another hard-hitting truth. Drop a comment below and let me know. What would you have done if you found this in your own home?